In terms of awareness, we noticed that early adopters, most of the early adopters interacted with company officials to understand the product offering. But what's interesting is that most of the late adopters heard about the product from friends and family who have used that product and have experienced the advantage. So from a firm's perspective, it is absolutely critical to identify who your early adopters would be and meticulously focus on those adopters because they're the ones who are ultimately going to become promoters of your product in the second leg of expansion. So this is just an example of a company that we invested in Kenya, Juhudi Kilimo. It's a microfinance operation that provides asset financing to smallholder farmers for productive uses. Again, example of a company that meticulously framed what the early adopter would look like and then focused on those early adopters to ultimately create the ripple effect. Then is affordability. As I mentioned earlier, the absolute price of the product or service that you're selling is important. But what is even more important is that farmers are able to access that product at that low price when they have money in their pocket. And financing in farming situations is absolutely critical because there are only a few instances in a year where farmers actually have money in their pocket, and typically most of the inputs used by the farmer are through some sort of financing. Again, this is an example of a company that we invested in India, GWP, that provided drip irrigation solutions to smallholder farmers. The company basically used the exotic drip system, stripped it down to the bare bones through reducing the cost of or reducing the thickness of the outer layer of the laterals to bring the cost down to 90% of what it was. Again, focusing on the primary customer as the smallholder farmer. What the company also did, and this is an interesting learning, is that the minimum size of the unit needs to be small enough for the farmer to experience the product on their land. So what GWP did was they broke down the minimum unit, which was 1 acre, to a unit that was less than a quarter of an acre so that farmers can experience the product before they would incrementally add more product to their land. Then is the question of access. There's a lot of talk about last mile distribution. We think last mile is important, but more important is to match access with farmers' purchasing habits and their transportation constraints. So if the farmers are visiting the input market for purchase of seeds and fertilizer and other inputs, that might be a good point of sale instead of thinking about getting everything to farmers' doorstep. In terms of access, the other piece which is absolutely critical, which I mentioned for affordability as well, is that timing is essential. So if the farmers cannot access the product at the time that they need it, it's virtually useless for them. And then there are a range of distribution models that we looked at, but I won't go into the details of that here. Now we looked at a range of companies, both within Acumen's portfolio and beyond. We specifically looked at over 100 data from over 100 companies, and we saw that only a few were able to achieve sustainable scale. A lot of companies were not hitting big numbers, even in year 8, 9, and 10 of their operations. And interesting that only less than 5% of the companies that we profiled and looked at had achieved 250,000 customers or 25,000 suppliers in a single year. And so the big question was for us was that what would allow these companies to achieve good scale? So we came up with what we have defined as the repeatable model in the report. And essentially, repeatable model is at the core of achieving good scale for these enterprises. It has 4 components. Number 1 is focus. So the company, the enterprise, needs to focus on who the core customers are, needs to focus on what are the core markets for this enterprise, and then basically prioritize their growth options accordingly. Then the question, the second aspect of repeatable model is how have you embedded your model with routines and cultures that would allow the enterprise to systematically convert strategy into action. Thirdly is adaptation. It's absolutely critical for these companies, these enterprises to adapt over time based on how competition is shaping up, how customer needs are shaping up. Because these enterprises are operating in a dynamic environment, so unless there's strong routines within these enterprises to hear feedback from the market and incorporate, the chances of these companies achieving good scale are extremely challenged. Lastly, are these companies investing ahead of growth in talent and systems? So this is the repeatable model framework, and this is something that we at Acumen actively work with our companies to implement over and over again. Would love to take any questions, comments once the panel discussion starts. Thank you so much.
Does it work? So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for this opportunity to share some preliminary results from an initiative that CIRAD had about its impact. A few years ago, CIRAD started a comprehensive survey of its impact, and for that we had to develop a specific methodological tool that I'm going to present to you. And I'm going to share with you the first results, because we are in the process of computing all the results we have over these cases. So first of all, impact assessment, there are clearly 2 scientific community. The first one is about a financial evaluation of the surplus and cost-benefit assessment of an innovation, for example. Generally it proves a good return of research. And the second community would be more about understanding how it works, to approach the causal mechanisms of the leading to impact at scale. It uses also quantitative tools, but only to address questions in a framework of a systemic approach. And it tries to characterize the condition under which agricultural research can contribute to development. So obviously, CIRAD chose to be in this community, to use this approach. And in this approach, obviously, the term attribute impact to CIRAD or to research is not possible. We're just exploring the contribution that research has on these issues. And the second point is that innovation and impact takes time. This is an example from Dr. Parley about US technological-based innovation, and the time it took to get at scale in the field. So we're speaking about 30, 40, 50, even 96 years for BD corn. If you take the whole cluster that fed the innovation to reach this scale. So it takes time. So in that initiative, CIRAD went back on a collection of case studies, innovation case studies that we worked on 20 years ago, and we went back and invest a lot of effort on the field to understand how it worked. So we selected 13 case studies of innovation, not only a showcase of successes, but place where we invest a cluster of projects of research to understand what was the use of our results along the years. And these cases are generally ex post, 15 to 25 years after the project ended, after the research delivered its output. And we led these surveys with a team of researchers, almost 6 months on field surveying with farmers what has been the impact over these years. The basic of the method impress that we built, because we didn't find a method that would fit to our expectations, was first is based on impact pathway. This is a classical approach, but I put this very generic scheme. It seems to be linear, and at the end, I'm going to show you that it's not at all linear. And what we want to do in our IMPRESS study is that we want to explore each arrow and be able to document and explain each one of the arrows we put on this impact pathways. The originality of the choice of CIRAD was to use, from the beginning to the end of this survey, participatory tool. We want to see and interview end users, beneficiaries, farmers, policymakers, a whole set of stakeholders around innovation process, around impact process. That's the first point, which is not that common. The second point is that we wanted to have two focus, one on the way research speaks to policymakers, and the other point was to speak about the capacity building along this innovation and impact process. So let me summarize a little bit the method and how it works with participatory tools along the five steps process. First of all, we went back to the original researchers, sometimes retired, to tell their ambition at that time about this project. What did they expect at that time about the impact? And we tried to rewrite a narrative of this story, a long story, to try to draw a very rough impact pathway design, interviewing several key actors at the beginning. The second stage was so at this point we had a narrative, we had a story, we had the chronograms, we had dates, interaction, a specific moment where we think that the innovation got impact. The second point was to gather a kind of a workshop with different stakeholders, sometimes with up to 100 stakeholders, to confront this narrative with them, to confront the conception of what happened, the impact pathways, and to start to describe impact. What did they feel about the impact? Which you're going to see is quite different what researchers expect as impact indicators. We call this impact descriptors that we had then to go back. So that's an example of a map. I'm going to take the Highland rain-fed rice in Madagascar. We involved in that study more than 500 farmers in a we went to the bottom of the story and we discussed the map of actors along the story of innovation. And then we went back to survey and try to check what the first participatory workshop say about the story, about the indicators of impact, about the impact pathway stages. And then we built a classical, I won't get into details of that, but it's just to show you how complex it is. Because it's based not on the assumption of the impact, but on real feeling, real perception of the impact pathways from the stakeholders. So it's very classical. You have input of research, output of research, and then the key, I would say the black box of the innovation system is the outcome process. I'll come back to it in a moment. And then impact one, we define that a little bit different from other methods. Impact one is the impact gotten at the beneficiary level in direct contact with researchers. And impact two, I would say, is kind of upscaling, outscaling, and spillover effects of impact one. And so we try to document each one of these arrows is documented by a story, is documented by a survey, and sometimes by numbers, but because we went back to indicators, checking the descriptors of impact that the farmers told us, and check and try to find if we can document it. Sometimes, in that case, we found negative impacts that were commonly mentioned by farmers, and so we try to understand how it worked. along the impact pathways. And sometimes we had unexpected impact. I give you this impact mentioned by farmers in Madagascar about the peaceful mind they got to have this kind of variety in upland rain-fed rice. And so we try to understand, and again, it's not just a box, it's the story behind this box. The fourth step is to gather data and quantitative analysis of the indicators and to refine with several focus group and interviews the story. And then the last point, again, another workshop with all the stakeholders to give the last narrative of the impact and to validate it and to refine it. So that's the method. I will share with you here the first two lessons that we got from these 13 case studies. The ambition is big because we wanted to have a very diverse case collection representing the diversity of innovation where CIRAD is involved. Some of these innovations are really technology-based, very simple, new variety. Sometimes it's much more complex, it's more institutional change, organizational innovation. And we wanted to treat these 13 cases across with the same methodology. We're not successful yet, but we hope we get across lessons from these cases. So first of all, I want to share with you the understanding of the black box of the outcomes. For us, outcomes is a key point to understand what happened, seen by the different stakeholders that allow impact to progress. And in the rice in Madagascar, we saw that these outcomes, we analyzed around 60 different stories of outcomes building across the cases, and we try to figure out what are the common messages that we get from that. I'll come to that in a minute. So that's a key point because outcomes is the place where research interacts with stakeholders. Well, farmers, policymakers, extensionists, and we have to understand how it works, what is expected from research, and at what stage we need to trigger them. And for each kind of outcome, there is an expectation from research. And we can see that in most of the cases of outcomes, research is involved. Sometimes it's not involved, but sometimes it's involved. And it's involved with learning situation. And that's the second lesson we got from this collection of cases. We document each moment where there is a learning situation, either for researcher, for farmers, for policymakers, and we try to understand how it works. How does it work to create or to organize or to participate to a learning situation to manage impact pathway. And this is very interesting because learning situation happens not only at outcome level, but also at research level. That's the case of most participatory research scheme, and also at upscaling level. You have a lot of learning processes happening at big scale at that point. So we are still studying this data. We have 60 outcome situations that we are trying to understand, 43 learning situations that we are trying to understand. Many times, these situations are not planned ahead. They're not organized. They happened, and people say 10 years later that it happened. So we have to understand that. And the most important thing to retain for CIRAD is that researchers are called to make different jobs in this learning situation. Sometimes they are experts, sometimes they are trainers, sometimes they are mediators, coordinators, sometimes they are learners. And this multitask job of researchers is extremely important for CIRAD. We have to understand that because CIRAD, it's my conclusion, has the conviction that it's very difficult to announce the impact we hope before a research project. All the funders ask to have your theory of change, the impact you want to reach, but nobody goes back in the field 15, 20, 25 years later to see what happens. So CIRAD decided not to equip teams with this ex-ante impact assessment or announcement, but more to grow a culture of impact across the teams, across researchers, to make them aware of the different interaction they have with different stakeholders, I didn't mention that we have the same kind of mapping for policymakers' interaction, and it's extremely important for upgrading and upscaling and outscaling, because obviously the interaction between stakeholders and policymakers, researchers and policymakers, is a key ingredient for upscaling and outscaling. The second thing is that in the case we had where there is participatory scheme of research, we had 2 cases of participatory breeding of sorghum and groundnut. The outcomes are much easier to get, much quicker to get, because from the beginning, the research question is co-formulated by the stakeholders, and the outcome is started right at the beginning of the process. And the last point is that if we really want to get impact at scale, I think researchers has to understand that their role is different than just produce scientific knowledge. And many people said that in this session. We have to be able to communicate, to intermediate, to coordinate, to speak with different stakeholders, not at all about scientific issues, but to be aware of how it works, how outcomes are built, to be aware to reach an impact at the end. So instead of announcing an impact, an announcing of theory change, we want our researchers in CIRAD, and I forgot to mention that these studies have been made with our partners in Southern NARS. We want to improve the culture of impact of our teams. Thank you very much.
Thanks, No. Thanks, Bruce. Thanks, Etienne. Well, I catch up that at least from these 3 big keywords, one is complexity and not complication. Complexity that we are, as Bruce said, trying to deal with. The second one is anything we do involve multiple scales, and that was the debate of the morning. And the third one is learning process, learning the one we are looking at and learning among researchers. Please, the floor is opened if you want to interact between you or together with the 3 panelists. Just after, we will have a coffee break, and I will explain before the coffee break how we meet again and how we can look at a nice piece of cake out of the ingredients we had during the whole day. The floor is yours.
Hi, it's Dave Watson, the Mace CRP. First of all, I'd like to thank you guys for 3 very interesting presentations. I have 2 questions. My first question is the Acumen report publicly available? And secondly, will the CIRAD report be publicly available? I think they're both very interesting. They'll be both very interesting reads. My second question, knowing Sub-Saharan Africa pretty well and getting to know South Asia pretty well is, and this is to the Acumen presentation, what were the main differences that you found between South Asia and East and Southern Africa where you had your studies?
Before answering, we go around quite a set of questions. Please, Juan Lucas.
Yes, thank you for 3 very nice presentations. I would like you to maybe complement on 2 ideas that Bruce and Etienne shared from different perspectives. Bruce mentioned the 3/3, and Etienne mentioned the importance of the researcher involving itself more in the downstream communication and engaging in that manner. And I don't see that the skill set and the education of a researcher focuses on that currently, and not either the incentives. The salary scales are associated more with the academic production, the publication, so on and so forth, and there is very little examples of associating the payment and scaling and progression in an institution of researchers in terms of salary with more downstream objective productivity work. So maybe if you can complement from what your experience of what you're seeing, because I think it's I manage a research institution, and it's always an obsession. How do you combine those thirds in terms of skill set, and how you make sure that the researcher has the ability to leave the lab and to communicate and to do that type of work? That's very important for this discussion as well.
Peter Carberry from Microsat. Etienne, I really liked the approach to impact assessment that CIGIAR are taking, a learning approach. My question is, how much do you draw on theory in terms of looking for the attributes you're trying to attribute to impact? So there's theory around human decision making, about cognition, about people behaviour, that you can set the framework for finding those attributes. So is there a theoretical underpinning to the IMPRESS program?
Just here.
Excellent presentations, and I'm very curious about these two reports as well. I have a quick question to you, Bruce. You used the word opportunistics, and we are opportunistic. Some of us are even promiscuous, talking about science. But you said these quick moves when you're responding in 24 hours instead of 2 years. And I guess that they're different in quality in that response. Do you jeopardize your credibility and the position of science that I believe very much in, and the trade-offs and the reasoning? It depends very much on what you respond to, I guess. But what is your elaborations about that? Thanks.
Well, I guess that's a very consistent first set of questions to answer. One of you would like to begin the same order, or?
So, Jean-Lucas' question, I think it's a real challenge, but perhaps what didn't come across is it's a teamwork as well, so that there are diverse skill sets, and some you can accept as total scientists who are not going to speak very well to stakeholders. And we were lucky in our program in that all the key positions that we needed for outcome delivery were hired competitively, and we selected for the characteristics that we needed in terms of, so we didn't select for the greatest scientists in the world. We selected for facilitating engagement type specialists. But I think it's a mega challenge, because even with the people that we work, they think about after the CG, and it's often an academic career, and they haven't got enough publications, for example. So there's a real problem in terms of that. I think that there's some real big trade-offs in terms of quality and scientific credibility. But one of our principles is a legitimacy through high-impact publications. And you can see there's already a trade-off. So we believe that we get into the World Business Council through really good engagement skills, but also through the BBC reporting of our science paper. So we have to have a portfolio of approaches to balance those trade-offs.
So first question, yes, the report will be published probably by the end of this year, because we're still working on the results. There on my presentation the name of the site where you can find more details, but the final report will be published. The second question about Juan Lucas is interesting about the skills. Obviously, it's very difficult to gather a dream team with a first-class scientist and the skill to animate, to coordinate this kind of a complex situation, transcultural situation, speak to policymakers. So at the same time, we want to, in CIGIAR, to improve the culture of impact, to train people to know that it's not as simple as they think. There is no magic bullet for innovation and to reach impact at scale. It's a complex issue, and probably, and we're not convinced that yet, probably it's very diversified depending on the nature of innovation and the nature of the context. So there is not really emerging rule that to get impact at scale, we have to do that and that and that. We have to be cultivated to be able to react. So it's very difficult to find both skills in the same person, so it's a teamwork. The last, but it's teamwork, but at the same time, CIRAD as an institution wants to train its teams and researchers to be more cultivated about impact. The last point about theory behind this analysis, I think we have a 30 researchers team working on these cases. Next week we have a gathering of international people very engaged in this problematic, like Boru, Dawait, etc. We found very strong conceptual tools for local innovation system dynamics. We have a strong capacity in CIRAD about that. We had more difficulty to characterize learning situations, but we got very good inputs from the fish CRP's specialist about that, especially Boru. We helped us to design this capacity to innovate indicator of impact. And the last point was it's extremely difficult to find any conceptual tool about how research impact policy. Very difficult. And we asked for School of Politics. We have several universities to find ways. It's very easy to find how you can evaluate impact of politics, but how research impact politics is more difficult. So we are kind of weak in that sense for this point.
Yeah, so the report, Growing Prosperity, was published last year in Jan 2015. That's available, should be available on our website. In case you don't find it, feel free to reach out to me. Secondly, your question about the differences between farmers in South Asia and Africa. I mean, in our experience, farmers face 4 basic pain points. It's access to inputs, access to extension, access to credit, and access to offtake arrangements. And that's pretty consistent across any developing part of the world. The difference between South Asia and Africa primarily is that South Asia went through a green revolution in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So the yields in most crop types are much, much better. Markets are much more lubricated than what you'd find in Africa, where yields are still considerably lower than what you'd find for similar crops in South Asia, and markets are not as lubricated. So I guess those would be the primary differences between the two regions.
Any more? Yes, please. Just wait for the micro, because otherwise we cannot listen to.
It was Noor, is it? 2 questions. How do you link up to international research organizations with the Bain Company? Are you in a regular context, or is this more kind of occasionally? Or do you tap on that? Yes, the Bain Company. And the second is there no big difference between, regarding your response about Asia and Africa, how important is the legal framework? We had a presentation from Malawi where they said, listen, we know we can never claim, we can never make anybody responsible in front of the law, and this is very much a stumbling block in Africa to build up any company. That it's just, you cannot, and I think business models that capture, that cope with the African business culture are still very sparse.
And just before you answer, no, is there any other comment? Yes, please. Just a second.
Thanks very much. Just a question of clarification to the gentleman from CIRAD. Clearly very interesting to hear that you're taking the active route to looking at different types of impact. But it's not clear to me, and clearly that's important that different types of impact are appreciated well beyond just the cost-benefit analysis that normally occurs. But could you give some kind of a indication of the scale of the impact, though? I mean, so types of impact, yes, are important, but you're talking about participatory community projects, I think in most cases. So maybe if you could give us also an impression of scale of impact that you were talking about, but it wasn't really clear to me what that was. And then the second question is, in relation to that, why did you decide to talk only to farmers about this? Oh, that's what I understood.
No other further questions before coffee break, eh? So, no, and Etienne will answer these two questions. Bruce, if you want to comment as well, please.
So on the question of our linkage with research organizations, so we at Acumen are making an effort to link up with research organizations, and my participation here is part of that sort of effort to understand what's going on in the research and innovation space. But our companies, the companies that we invest in, are actively sort of engaged with local research organizations in their respective regions. But we as Acumen need to obviously do a better job at linking up with innovation systems. The second point of the second question you had about legal framework, I think that's a challenge across the developing world. So any contracts that you put together with farmers or farmer groups, there's no way you can enforce those contracts. There's something called social collateral, which is much more powerful than any sort of legal way of enforcing these contracts.
First of all, we didn't talk only to farmers. The example of the rice was 500 farmers interviewed, but at the same time we had many interviews or focus groups with policymakers, extensionists, industries around rice, etc. The problem in our collection is that we wanted to treat with the same method 13 very different cases. And so sometimes we have a case, for example, about innovation in the way Vietnam, Laos organize their policy about animal health. So it's not technological driven, it's just institutional driven. So it has been very difficult to use the same methodology, and we are still coping with that. In terms of scale of impact, but we speak with all the stakeholders. In terms of scale of impacts, I must say that we decided to have these 13 case studies to represent the different situation of CIRAD actions with its partners. And at some point, it was very sobering, the scale of impact. I give you an example. We invested a lot in fonio treatment, post-harvest treatment machine 20 years ago. Because to break the fonio hull, it's a lot of work. And we invested a lot 20 years ago to make this machine. We found builders, little industries to build this machine in Mali and Burkina Faso. And at the end, we went back to the country and we saw very few machines going on. So the question was, is it a failure? Maybe not. But why it was so few machines going on? So that was the interest of in some point we had a very good scale of impact. For example, we have a case about internet recognition of weeds or species that is used widely by custom officers in Asia, by farmers in Africa, by tens of thousands of people, and this is a wide impact. So it's very different across the 13 cases. But I can say that at the end, if you compare the price of investment in research and the result 20 years later, it's very sobering sometimes.
Okay, I think we can give them a big hand. And before we move to the coffee break, first, you may have noticed that I didn't use the bell. That was part of the learning process. We are just in time. And we are not late, behind schedule. Second, we will take advantage of the coffee break to come back, and as there is quite a lot of room for people, please come together because the next time will be a working session where you will be asked not only to listen and interact, but you will be asked to try to capture the lessons we can learn from all this presentation and from all your own knowledge and practice along the time on what we should take into account when we are looking at scaling. And then please, I apologize in advance if you have personal effects. Please come together in some tables so you can act and interact and work together. There will be on each table a file with the questions that are the ones you are asked to look at to draw lessons from what we've been discussing from the beginning, and then you will have you will be asked to come back at 4:30, and as you will have, we will have 1.5 hours to stay together. We will finish at 6 o'clock sharp. We will have 1.5 hours, so you are asked to work together during 1 hour, and then we move around the tables to try to capture the main messages in terms of lessons. That will be the first working group. The second working group will be tomorrow, but then Friday morning. But then you will know more about it, and that will target much more recommendation rather than lessons. So first working group, lessons. Second working group, recommendations. You have as well an evaluation form. You'll be asked to fill it in, but please don't fill it now. Because as you've understood right from this beginning, this has been a progressive and gradual process, and we make the hypothesis that we are all remaining all together, and the evaluation is just at the end to know what you could capture out of the sessions. Well, please enjoy your coffee break. Before that, I have the big responsibility of thanking them very warmly.